This is my well-rounded cock, a budget Ive winner cast on crit Deadeye I set up with the goal of making a relatively smooth mapper while keeping uber viability on as low of a baseline cost as possible. The core interaction I'm using here is chaining with Ive Winter. You see, we used to all do this with Ive Winter and Hydrosphere, but Hydrosphere has since been nerfed. Tornado, though, doesn't quite have the same restriction as Hydrosphere regarding hits. It does, however, have one restriction. It can only be hit 20 times before it can no longer be chained off of. However, because I'm using Asenath's Mark in my current build, I'm able to refresh the duration of Tornado every 0.3 seconds. In other words, I have the old legacy chaining that we used to abuse with Hydrosphere that got nerfed. But in general, low investment cast on crit builds are really hard to do, especially if you want to survive. Defensively, I'm running a mix of Grace, Discipline, and Ghost Shrouds, and then I have a Wind Dancer Invocation on my Sanctified Relic to give me a better maximum physical hit. Obviously, like every other build, I have suppression cap, and then I'm running a life gain on hit Shaper Ring because of how many hits I have Winter alongside of Blast Rain have. And finally, I have Energy Shield Leech on a Mastery node. Don't get me wrong, this isn't gonna survive in hardcore without real investment into defenses. I think you could take something like what Garatha set up a little while back with Cast and Crit Blazing Salvo and turn it into this, and it'd actually be much stronger as long as you could fit in Asenath's Mark. Speaking of low investment problems, mana cost is the other major problem. See, I can't really be using things like Divergent Inspiration because that would cost basically half of my build. I've also avoided Eldritch Battery because it would really scuff your defenses, and you can't really use Diadem on here anyway. To solve my mana problems, I run 5 key sources of mana reduction. Firstly, Inspiration Support reduced my mana cost by 34%. Secondly, I run a Militant Faith Timeless Shield, which gives me mana cost reduction per devotion, of which I have 150. Thirdly, I actually run a Diamond Flask with a Surgeon's Prefix and a suffix of reduced mana cost, which gives me another 24-25% depending on how I roll it. Now, the thing with that flask is that I'm actually able to sustain it even though I'm not using Mage Blood or Pathfinder because of how many critical strikes I deal per second. In addition to these percentage reductions, I run 2 sources of flat reduction. Firstly, 2 pieces of jewelry have minus mana cost Eldryon Crafts, and then I run a Watcher's Eye with Clarity with reduced mana cost to round everything up. The POB for this build probably looks a little bit more expensive than it actually is. Let's go over a couple things first. The Jewels of Voices, this is actually a 5p Voices which costs 40 chaos. It's also not necessarily mandatory, and I'm not even sure it's ideal. A large cluster with good 3 prop would actually be better, but that actually tends to be more expensive than running this Voices. I run 3 mediums, a bunch of different things are usable here. Just having any sort of crit chance is quite helpful though, especially because it double dips on both your trigger bait and also your spell crit chance. The other core uniques, as I already mentioned, are a Watcher's Eye with Clarity, Asenath's Mark, which is fairly cheap, and this is an optional enchant, Abhorrent Interrogation, which is a really cheap pair of gloves, which allows us to completely avoid penetration, instead of trading that off for Wither, and Mark of the Shaper. I'm using a cast on crit bow. There are far better spellcaster bows you can do. 6 socket, Tainted Fusings, cheapest way to go. The quiver is really cool. I actually start with a base Fracture for life, and then I use an Essence for global crit multi, and as long as there's an open suffix after this, I can go craft on this Frenzy Charge on critical strike node, which is just from Unveils. My chest is looking for suppression, life, res, and this regen node actually isn't very good. I should probably get rid of that. Ideally, I'd be going for 2 aura effect implicits, but this is pretty good as is. These boots are actually really insane. I rolled the implicits myself, but honestly, you don't get that much value out of Brittle Ground. I would probably encourage Scorch Ground if anything, or just action speed, because honestly, playing around this ground effect as a relatively squishy character just isn't really the move. My amulet, again, is just multi +1, and then with an Elryon craft for an open prefix. Life would be great here, didn't really get it. This ring is another sort of thing you'd want to self-craft. So you want to grab any sort of hybrid Shaper Elder base, and then from there you can either reforge life or reforge caster to get the gain life per enemy hit with spells mod. There's other things you can go for, like a Delve ring with cold damage leech, which I think actually competes just because having a source of leech is pretty good as well. Alternatively, you could drop these gloves and go for rare gloves with cold damage leech. I do think some form of life recovery beyond your flask though makes for a much more enjoyable mapping experience. The skill tree is fairly self-explanatory, so you can take what you will from the POB itself. One thing to know is that I do path all the way up here and grab Whispers of Doom, because I'm an elemental build, and depending on how you want to play the build, you could also offer adjacent animosity and then get the mastery for less projectile speed if you really want to optimize single target. However, this will gimp your clear on Ive Winter even more, which already isn't the best clearing skill in the game. The skill gem setup though is actually quite interesting. So I'm running a 6 socket aura setup in my chest because I have an open 6 link. In lane 3 at this time of the league is pretty cheap now, and a bunch of auras here. I run Frostbite as a self-cast skill and then a cast damage taken on Mortal Call because Molten Shell has low value because I have almost no armor. Sniper's Mark is another manual cast, and in my helmet I'm running a utility tornado setup, doubling my damage or even more, but also giving me things like Arcane Surge, Onslaught, and Power Charge on crit, all of which are really good mods, this especially while you're mapping, and these 2 for boss single target. My main links are with Eye of Winter, Blast Rain, and the cast on crit is built into my bow. I also offer Stormwind when I boss, but you could also go for something like Tornado Shot or Rain of Arrows. I think Blast Rain is probably as low as I'd want to go for trigger rate while mapping. And then I'm using just some damage supports, Inspiration, Crit Damage, Awaken Out Cold, and Hypo. I have a Vortex, Flame Dash, and Bone Chill here on my gloves. I left click Vortex. And then finally this Frost Bomb is just put into the POB to simulate the exposure that I'm getting from my relic. I also have Wind Dancer on my Sanctified Relic. I think this costs like 40C. Again, just a really cheap setup. If there's something that stands out to you as being extremely expensive, I'd probably avoid it outside of a few things. So you can't avoid mana cost, you can't avoid Asnas Mark, and that's, well, pretty much it actually. Just to sum up, the reason why this build performs so well is because Eye of Winter with Chain is extremely broken, and Eye of Winter as a spell skill in general right now is probably one of the strongest baseline spell skills, especially if you go ahead and choose to pair it with anything like sword projectile stacking or chain. All in all, I thought this was a pretty successful project considering the mix of budget, offense, defense, and playability, and I hope it gives inspiration for other people to make a cock as well rounded as this one.